Yes, Guyana to the world.
GlobeSpan is a Guyanese dialogue moving towards the realization of one nation in one Guyana. It's a platform that offers an all-inclusive discussion with the pros, the cons, the ones that is taken aside, and the ones that stand in the middle. GlobeSpan believes agreeing and disagreeing are part of the nation's building.
She is a beauty, beautiful Guyana, with wonderful people all over this country.
GlobeSpan believes every Guyanese voice is part of the nation's building. As we span the globe for voices from the diaspora and those living home, we stand on our commitment that we are all Guyanese working towards one nation in one Guyana. As the world turns on its axis bringing changes, we as Guyanese must adapt to those changes for a better Guyana for all. GlobeSpan stands on its axis with its belief that one nation, one Guyana, one destiny must include voices from all corners of Guyana.
With many flavors, 6 different people blended together. Raise your flag high in unity, we're family with one destiny. Raise your flag high in unity.
Good evening, colleagues, and welcome to the GlobeSpan 24/7 Wednesday program. Tonight, I'm your host, Terrence Blackman, Chair and Associate Professor of Mathematics at Medgar Evers College. And I'm joined by Dr. David Hines, sociologist and cultural critic, Dr. Betaram Ramharak, historian, political science, Dr. Vincent Alexander. I want to say you're a political strategist and educator, but I think more importantly, you're someone who has played a significant role in political issues in Guyana. And Mr. Ravi Dev, who many of you know from Roar, but I think is also one of the more insightful commentators on political matters in Guyana. Tonight, these distinguished gentlemen have the task of talking about the mobilization for the 2025 Guyanese elections. I think this is a very well received initiative on the part of GlobeSpan 24/7 to really kind of ventilate some of the issues that go to the impending Guyanese election. What I thought I'd do would be to kind of have each panelist provide a brief opening statement on the importance of mobilization for the upcoming elections. And in the context of providing a statement on mobilization for the upcoming elections, I wanted them to kind of give a general overview as what they saw as the most critical issues that would drive voter mobilization in the 2025 Guyanese elections. So I won't sort of take the time up as the moderator, but have folks. So maybe I'll start with you, Dr. Ramharak. What do you see as the most critical issues that drive voter mobilization in the 2025 election? And then I'll come to the others. You're muted.
Technology, sorry. Good evening. Well, you know, in response to your question, I don't want to sound too philosophical, but let's take a look at what we are seeing that is being played out in Guyana. And one of the, you know, we can't say we have the same old. That's true to a certain extent, because we really have 2 dominant political parties. And we still do have an ethnic issue we're trying to deal with. One of the things that David Hines has always said, which I think there's some truth to it, which is that, you know, we live in a multicultural plural society, and therefore we can, since we interact, we can speak of and about other people as well as ourselves. However, it's very difficult to speak for the other, right? So that's the society in which we live. So therefore, we have different narratives. One of my problem right now is that the narratives on one side seems to be the only dominant narrative that exists today. And I think mobilization is based on that narrative. And because that narrative is so strong and it's primarily focusing on the ethnic issue, it means that that is going to be a critical issue in the election, regardless of what people may say, whether they're with the government or not with the government. And I think the other issue we are seeing in terms of mobilization is the whole issue of Nigel Hughes. I mean, when he announced it, he was all over social media. He's not a new personality, he's been around. But Nigel is a very articulate and intelligent lawyer. And the whole issue that came about with that, if we're talking about the issue of mobilization for 2025, is this notion of conflict of interest. I don't believe that's an issue. It's not going to be a big issue. 2025. To me, everybody in Guyana have a conflict of interest. It just gives people a language to talk, right? A couple of words to focus on. He may lose some votes because of that. What would have been more revealing is if we found out that Nigel and Kathy had shares in Exxon. That would have been a bombshell. But again, I don't think conflict of interest is such a major issue. Focusing on this issue of mobilization, and I'm gonna stop here, but I want to make this point, which is that the AFC, which seems to be reviving itself, right, from where it was, if conflict of issue is not going to be the damaging effect on the AFC, what is going to be more damaging to the AFC? And this is where I think the focus has to be, right? Which is that the votes has to come, the mobilization has to come from someplace. So if you're looking at the AFC, the question is, where is that vote going to come from? It's not going to come from the PPP, I don't believe so, because there's one good thing that the PPP has done. One thing that they do very well is mobilizing and winning and preparing for election. So are they going to take votes from the PNC? Maybe. I know Nigel is very much connected to the Amerindian community, but the Amerindians are also changing. There's a lot of intermarriage. It's not the same kind of community that you had in the 1960s when the UF was very prominent. So you have other issues which were there before, but which is going to come into play again. And here's another one that I would throw out there. When we talk about consensus, and this seems to be a word that we're hearing again, consensus for who? Who is going to be that consensus? Is it going to be someone from the opposition? If that's the case, then is that really a consensus candidate? You have the other issue of coalition, which seems to be something that's being thrown out there. So coalition has a terrible image when it comes to the AFC. And here's one other issue I also want to mention, which is the whole question of what the AFC has done in terms of representing the people, you know, who in a sense give their reputation to that political party. I'm talking about, you know, Kamraj Ramjatan, you know, Moses Nagamutu, people from Borabis, who were supposed to be, according to Moses, that 11% that give the majority to the coalition. Where is that 11% going to come from? Because it seems to me that both the PNC and the AFC, and of course the WPA has already written this off, where is that Indian element going to come from to give the AFC or the PNC that number that they need to be in government. I don't see that happening. And I do see the PPP winning 2025 when we talk about mobilization.
Oh, hold that. I will come to this question of predictions and expectations a bit later, but just to get to the critical issues. So I think you cited racial tensions. You've talked about some narratives. You've kind of talked about Nigel Hughes and the AFC, the Amerindian community, consensus and coalition. And you've raised the important point. To win this thing, you need 50.1. And so you need an 11% coming from somewhere for someone. Mr. Vincent Alexander, what do you see as the most critical issues that will drive the voter mobilization? And do you agree in part with some of the issues that have been raised by Dr. Amarak?
First of all, let me thank you for the correction from doctor to Vincent, Mr.
Sorry. You're a learned man. You always appear to be a scholar, so I always assume that is.
Thank you for that recognition as well. When I saw the topic, I wasn't quite sure what was the scope. And therefore, I thought that on one hand, the question of voter mobilization should be a part of what is discussed. And to a very large extent, Beta Ram has put that in focus. But I also thought that resource mobilization and the mobilization required of the Elections Commission also should be focused on. And I think that I am well poised to comment on that. So that for me, on one hand, we have to talk about the mobilization of the electorate. And in that regard, I think the question of ethnicity looms large because of the history of the country and because of the nature of the parties and the politics of the country. So I think that's one thing that has to be addressed in the mobilization of the people. But I also think that there is an issue of the ways in which people are mobilized. And I would like to look at the way in which things that are being done and have been done since 2020 are contributing to mobilization. Technical things that contribute to mobilization, and this may also be contributing to demobilization. I think as we talk about mobilization, we cannot ignore the incentive of participation because of predispositions about the electoral system, how it is skewed on one hand, and there is this pervasive view these days that it doesn't really matter what we do. What is critical is what the foreign powers want. I've heard that from so many people at various levels. It seems as if, even as you talk about mobilization, people seem to think that foreign powers have the last say in what happens. And somebody said to me the other day, if you want to run the country, you have to talk to exile. So that's another thing in mobilization, the impact of the external forces. I think the issue also of the presence and the role of small parties should be looked at. Third party. We have witnessed what has happened with joiner, panel, how that impacts mobilization among third parties as well as we have had some legislative changes which may impact and or facilitate mobilization, not unrelated to things I've mentioned earlier. So that too has to be looked at, the legislative changes, which may come in from a technical perspective and from a people's mobilization perspective. And in the context of the legislative changes, the way in which we have responded to complaints about the fault lines of the system, whether those responses have been negative, whether they've been positive, the way in which those responses too will influence people's mobilization or facilitate other acts that can contribute to mobilization. So I think there's a broad spectrum of things that one will have to speak about when one speaks about mobilization. Looking at, on one hand, people mobilization, looking at the resource mobilization, looking at the environment that influences mobilization, and the way in which these things are interlocking.
Thank you, Dr. Hines. Mr. Alexander raises sort of some very critical issues, but he added two to the list of questions that emerged from a set of issues that Dr. Rack raised. It doesn't matter what we do, the question of foreign powers and being a critical issue, and the small parties. And so I hesitate to say small parties because I know that the WPA is not, in a sense, a small party. But what do you see as someone who is part of the leadership of the Working People's Alliance as sort of critical issues that will drive voter mobilization in the 2025 Guyanese elections?
Thanks. I don't want to embarrass sociologists. I'm not a sociologist. I'm a political scientist by academic training, but I'm not a sociologist, and I don't want my acts of omission or other forms of transgression to fall on the heads of sociologists.
Yes.
Yeah. No, I think there are two overriding things that are going to drive voter mobilization. One, that has always driven voter mobilization, and that is ethnicity. Everything that my brother Betaram talked about, he may use other words, but it goes back to ethnicity. I mean, we mobilize, whether, as my friend Rafi says, crossover voting or stay-over voting. Ethnicity is the major form of mobilization. It has been so since we started self-government in the 50s to the present, and it remains so, and it will be more so this time around. Because we now have resources, and contrary to what some of us may have thought, that with more resources, ethnic competition would decrease. We are seeing that with more resources, ethnic competition increases. And there are three things that animate ethnic communities. One is the threat of disenfranchisement. And that would be a very big topic. The question of whether elections would be free and fair would be a big topic. So the threat of disenfranchisement animate ethnic communities. The second thing that animate them is the threat of dispossession. And again, because we have resources, the ethnic groups are competing for those resources. And African Guyanese have experienced a lot of dispossession of land, dispossession of property, as the state moves to quote unquote develop infrastructure. It has encroached on people's possession, what we loosely call ancestral possession, mainly land and property. And the third thing that animates ethnic communities is the threat of dishonor. And, you know, I as the African Guyanese community has experienced tremendous dishonor in the last 4 years. I mean, dishonor of the women, dishonor of the labor. I mean, the refusal of the state in a time of plenty to really pay them for their labor. It has echoes of enslavement and so forth. And so the very honor, we are in the emancipation period. And what has the government done? Instead of leaving African Guyanese to do their thing, the government has now using state resources to organize competing observances. The government has taken the money away from IPADG, which represents 78 organizations. So there's a lot of dishonoring of African Guyanese. And so therefore, as we enter the elections, we cannot avoid ethnicity. I am very sure that East Indians, Indian Guyanese also have their ethnic cries of dispossession, their cries of disenfranchisement, and their cries of dishonor. It is not for me to articulate that, but I am sure they do. I can articulate the African side. And so we cannot avoid ethnicity in this winner-take-all election, where if you win control over the state, you're in control over power, and if you lose all control over the institutional power. And so therefore, ethnicity has to be front and center. The other thing, Vincent raised it, is the role of external forces. We have always been in the grip of external forces, very much so during the Cold War. It eased a little bit after the fall of the Berlin Wall, but it came back once we got oil. And just as it's no secret that in 1964, the external forces played a pivotal role in the regime change of that year, the external forces played a pivotal role in the regime change of 2020. And once, as we learned after 1964, once you engage in that initial act of regime change, it follows, it continues. The country remains in the grip of external forces. And so the whole question of the role of who are the external forces going to favor as we go into the next election, I think that along with ethnicity would be the overriding things that will animate voter mobilization and voter participation. Now, of course, each group will have its issues. For African Guyanese, the issue of equitable distribution of resources. That issue is going to be front and center of mobilization. I think it's going to help to improve and increase mobilization to unprecedented levels among African Guyanese. The issue of cost of living, that is an issue that is going to be there for all ethnic groups, Indian Guyanese, African Guyanese, indigenous peoples, across the board. The question of cost of living is going to be front and center. Now, each group will come at it from where they see themselves. It's not going to be uniform, but the issue is going to be there. Whether Indian Guyanese are going to raise cost of living as a means of forcing the PPP to alter their policy to be more working class oriented African Guyanese may take a different tack. They will not be talking about class. They'll be talking about racial discrimination against them economically and so forth. So I think those big things of external interference, external role and ethnicity are the overriding things, and then each group would have its own issues that would help to mobilize them. And like I said, the cost of living cuts across ethnic groups.
Thank you, Dr. Hines. Mr. Dev, Dr. Hines, the political scientist, raises 4 very important issues that he believes will drive voter mobilization. Ethnicity, he argues, is the major form of mobilization. He notes that, the increase in resources available to Guyanese has counterintuitively increased the ethnic competition. And he cites these issues of the threat of disenfranchisement, whether or not the elections will be free and fair, issues of dispossession, issues of dishonor, and then the external forces, whether or not, who do the external forces favor, and equitable distribution of resources, and questions of the cost of living. How do you see it from where you sit? You can reflect on Dr. Hines's views or on Dr. Ramirak or Mr. Alexander's, but where do you stand? And actually, one of the issues that Dr. Hines raises is a kind of historical look. And so maybe as you respond, you might, a thought that occurred to me, how is the current climate sort of different from this climate different from previous election cycles in Guyana? So maybe you can respond to that, and then I'll ask other folks to comment on the question of, how is this different?
Well, let me first of all start off by talking about Dr. Hines' qualifications. The Buxton man, Dr. Hines, seemed to be disowning the Ifat man, Dr. Gomes, who founded the School of Sociology at Howard and ran it for 49 years. So, David, I hope you're not giving up on Dr. Gomes.
No, Dr. Gomes is my advisor, one of my PhD advisors, and yes. I don't want to stain him with my accent. I don't omission or commission.
All right, because he's a well-respected man in IFLUT and inspired me as a young man. Anyhow, to get back to the business that we're considering, the mobilization for 2025. And in fact, Dr. Hines has outlined some concerns of his, which I had categorized, and he might have thought unfairly, of him taking an extremist position in his articulation of the type of mobilization that is necessary in 2025. So I want to put this in context because we know each other for decades, and I think we need to talk to each other on these matters. And let's look at it historically, as you suggest, Terence, which is that, yes, ethnicity still dominates Guyanese politics and Guyanese political culture. We can't get away from that. It is there, and we must face it up front. And I'm very happy to see that at long last, first the PNC, in the form of Mr. Desmond Hoyt, accepted the salience of ethnicity just before he passed, and the PPP belatedly, by inference, seemed to have accepted its nature by jettisoning their Marxist-Leninism ideology, which evidently had put them into some kind of straitjacket to dismiss it as an epiphenomenon. Be as it may, speaking from where we have come from the very beginning of our entree into Guyanese politics in the 1980s, we believe ethnicity has dominated it, and to believe or do otherwise would be like Don Quixote tilting at windmills. We can't do that. The second thing is that, however, is that while ethnicity still dominates, in our case, the demographics of the ethnic factors have changed and changed significantly. And as Marxists like Dr. Hines like to say, the quantitative has changed the qualitative nature of the politics. And what do I mean by that? That we started out in Guyana with Indians having a preponderant majority. So in a majoritarian system, that gave them an advantage. And we had posited that it precipitated an ethnic security dilemma in African Guyanese, that if they played by the rules of the game, they were going to lose elections ad infinitum. Mr. Burnham, of course, quote unquote, solved that in one way by rigging elections for quite a while. And he was excused by his constituency because in terms of rational choice, it made choice to many of them. You know, we may disagree from some ethical standpoint, if you want to put it like that, but it made sense from a real politics standpoint. Be as it may, at this juncture, we have arrived at a situation where we are a nation of minorities. We are now in a situation like many other societies in which our politics are mirrored, especially in Africa. I like to look at Kenya and Ghana a lot in their politics. We're no one ethnic group. In their case, some may call it tribal, but it's ethnic, has to do with culture, your origins, dominates. So how does that change their politics qualitatively, as I said? So I'll talk in a normative sense, how it ought to change it. And this is where, David is here, I can speak frankly, this is where I'm a bit disappointed in his articulation of the type of mobilization that is necessary. You see, in these plural societies, especially in Africa, there's two ways to go about it when you have these groups that are different ethnically, but none of them forms a majority. One, there's the consociational approach. You can try to get them together in the grand coalition. And I don't want to get into all the details, but that's one way of approaching it. And our good friend, Henry Jeffrey, has always pushed that and continues to push that. But in Guyana, we have seen that while it has been articulated by some of the political parties, for example, both the PPP of Dr. Jagan talked about sharing after 92, and the PNC after Mr. Granger came and talked of sharing. It doesn't happen. So I think in real politics of Guyana, that's not a form of mobilization to mobilize for an overall grand coalition is not happening in Guyana. So what do we do? The other way, in a situation where you have a nation of minorities, is, David talked about crossover board, but there's a fancy academic term about it, centripetalism, where, centripetalism, which is that the type of politics that you should practice should be one which seeks to bring the groups together towards a center, So you do not, for instance, mobilize ethnically for your particular core group alone. It doesn't make sense. So for instance, if your core group is Indian Guyanese, as the PPP, their core group is, and one can even say they're an Indian party, it makes rational sense for them to reach across the various divides, and those are the African Guyanese votes, the mixed Guyanese votes and the Amerindian Guyanese votes, by and large. Chinese and Portuguese electorally don't matter much, apart from their money maybe. But to come back to it, it makes perfectly rational sense. And that is the format which is being pushed, this whole centripetalist approach. In certain societies that it's not happening, there are incentives by introducing different electoral mechanisms, such as something called the alternate vote, or some call the single transferable vote, where you don't just have one vote for one man, you then have a second choice, and a third choice, and a fourth choice. So after the first person is elected, your other choices go downwards. So people who were attractive to other ethnic groups, they then pick up their second choices. So it's one method. In Guyana, we don't need this special innovation. We already have it where it makes rational sense for us to reach across, tailor our programs to attract other voters. Yet David, again, he's being very honest and upfront, earlier in his presentation, talked about, well, he can only mobilize for African voters or African Guyanese voters. And for others, they can do the same. In other programs, I've heard him talk about, that if you get some Indian votes, that's gravy. Now, the point is, in this multi-ethnic society, we need voices of moderation, because we have seen that if we don't try to come to a center, how quickly what ethnic violence can erupt at the smallest spark. And we don't need that in Guyana. At long last, we have the wherewithal to develop our country. So I would like to say that, yes, the demographics have altered, and I think I was very happy when I saw Nigel Hughes, one of his first outreach, go out to Leonora. Second outreach to Parika, predominantly Indian areas within the markets. People are there, and the kind of receptivity that he got shows that that is where the hope of Guyana lies. Where you can go to people, speak frankly, speak honestly about their concerns too, as David accepts, and this is where I find somehow there's a contradiction here, accepts that Indian Guyanese has concerns about the PPP also. If there are corruption, which even the PPP accepts there's corruption, are Indian Guyanese concerned about that? Are all Indian Guyanese benefiting from all these contracts? No. So I believe, again, I want to conclude at this point, that in terms of mobilization, not looking at the external forces at this juncture, from what we can do in a normative sense, I would like to say that our political leaders ought to adopt this tone of moderation, and in trying to reach outside of their core group, they then will be forced to adopt that moderate tone, which I think can lead to progress. As to how much votes it will lead to, I think the votes are there. I think 2011 and 2015 showed that the votes are there. It's just that I believe the decision in Sugar, the APNU shot itself in its foot. But those concerns, I think, are manifesting themselves in other forms again, corruption being one of them. And I think that it is a way for the political parties to go.
Permit me to break the order, and I want to come back to you, Dr. Hines. So Mr. Dev sort of argues that ethnicity still dominates Guyanese political culture, but he argues that, in a sense, your focus on the issues of Afro-Guyanese could be an extreme position, and it's not mindful of the demographic changes. And I'll give a small demographic note. As I was sitting around earlier this afternoon, I listened to a podcast about the baby boomers in the United. Folks were talking about the chances for Kamala Harris, and one of the members of the panel pointed out that there 22 million baby boomers died, and so that's a voting bloc that is minus 22 million. And he pointed out that since the 2020 elections, there have been 8 million who have come of age in terms of become voters. And so, you know, I wanted you to respond first before I go to Dr. Ramharat, to this notion that we're now a nation of minorities. The demographics have changed, and there is a real crossover vote someplace, and perhaps, you know, a mobilization strategy that is focused on Afro-Guyanese threat of disenfranchisement, dispossession, and dishonor might move you away from this centripetalism that Mr. Dev is arguing. And
or Indian core will do the same thing.
Or yes. So yes, or you know, a similar kind of thing on the Indian side of the Indo-Guyanese side of the ball. I wanted you to respond before because this was particularly focused towards the comments that you offered, Dr. Hines.
Yeah, I know of many nations of minorities that still have ethnic voting. I don't, and still have ethnic majorities rule. This thing about a nation of minorities, I think it's nonsense. Right? At the end of the day, elections are not determined by your share of the population, determined by how many of your supporters you get to the poll. And you can have 40% of the population that are Indian Guyanese. But if the Indian Guyanese party is able to get 90% of its people to the poll, and the African party was only able to get 70% of it, the Indian party wins. And so this thing about the nation of minorities, I think it's nonsensical when we're speaking about it in terms of electoralism. The other thing that we are even. What we call mixed voters, for the majority of them, they vote along with African Guyanese. So this thing about African Guyanese being 40, or the PNC being a 40% party, and they need 11% to carry them over, I think it's not true, right? So I want to leave that in. Look, I am making a distinction between electoral mobilization in a winner-take-all system and multi-ethnic aspirations. I think we must aspire to be a multi-ethnic society where all ethnic groups must live in peace, live side by side with each other. But that don't win you elections in an ethnic competition. It don't win you elections, right? What Ravi is taking issue with me is, I'm saying, from the opposition standpoint, the hardest constituency at this time to crack is the East Indian constituency, the hardest. I think if any opposition leader tells me that it's easy to go crack the Indian vote, I tell you, you are past Indian people because you think they're stupid, right? Indian people have been socialized over decades to frighten anything that got PNC and Burnham inside. And that has not changed. In 2011 and 2015, they went with Nagamutu to the AFC and they Indianized the AFC. The AFC took that Indian vote and joined up with Burnham's PNC. That's it, over, story done, right? Ravi knows that. And so Ravi says, well, the PNC and the opposition should go after Indian votes. And then 5 minutes later, he says, the PPP will hold on to its base. But Ravi knows the PPP will hold on to its base, right? And he says later on that if the opposition wants to get Indian vote, you better go to them and tell them how they're going to make money because they like money. They have a special relationship with money. Ravi knows that the opposition, the present opposition, going after Indian Guyanese votes, I'm not saying they shouldn't, but I'm saying that's your hardest block. You have an easier block because in recent elections, I think since the 1997 election, but maybe 2001, but in the last 3 elections, the African Guyanese turnout has been around between 70 and 80%. It means, therefore, 20% of African Guyanese don't vote. And I'm saying you have about 4 or 5 seats sitting there that you can go and mobilize rather than spending your time going after 1 or 2 Indian Guyanese votes. That is going to be hard seats. That's going to be hard to come about. So I am arguing that an opposition mobilizing strategy for the election should be to go after 3 or 4 extra seats in the African Guyanese community. Hold on to your share, 40 to 45% of the Amerindian vote, and expend the least of your energy in trying to get Indian Guyanese a seat or 2 from the Indian Guyanese. And that if you're going to go after Indian Guyanese vote, to get your Indian Guyanese comrades to go into the Indian Guyanese community and mobilize there. Now they're going to get hell because they're going to be seen as Nima Karan and all that kind of story. But I'm saying if you must go there, the charge has to be led. So I am not talking about national aspiration. I'm talking about an electoral strategy. You go after that 4 or 5 or 6 seats of people in your constituency that don't go out to vote, that you put 75% of your energy there because it's going to be easier to convince them than to convince Indian Guyanese people. The question is, why should we leave the PPP? Yes, from a class standpoint, we are disappointed with the PPP, but look, a lot of that contract money is trickling down to us. We get a little something, all right? The cash grants, most of it come to us. Now, we're not getting the same as the Indian Guyanese elite, but we're getting something. When you come to teachers who are African Guyanese for the most part, they're getting 6.5%. And sugar workers are getting much more than that. So don't tell me that sugar workers and the teachers have the same issues when it comes to the distribution of resources. The African Guyanese teacher has more of an issue with the maldistribution of resources than the Indian Guyanese sugar worker. And so therefore, if you are the opposition and your base, and you have issues such as the inequitable distribution of resources, the mowing down of people's homes to build roads, the shooting of your young people by the police indiscriminately, and I can go on, the taking away of money, state monies from your premier organization. If you have those issues, why not run on it? Why do you dumb down those issues and go looking for a possible 1 seat from this bad strategy?
Dr. Ramharat, Dr. Hines makes a very pragmatic argument for the kind of mobilization of the base that he argued for initially. He says, look, if you're in an electoral game and you want to win, this is different from a national aspiration for a broadly multi-ethnic society, which, in a sense, goes against this kind of requiring, in a sense, the political actors to work towards a kind of middle. So I want to ask 2 sort of factual questions. In the last election, what percentage of the Indian vote went for the opposition? Can someone say with some precision what percentage, and then how would you characterize that strategy? How would that strategy of mobilization? How would you advise Dr. Hines in optimizing in this context? Is he correct that perhaps it is better to find the votes among your bigs? He noted that the Afro-Guyanese participation was about 79 or 80%, and so there are 20% of your own base voters that are not there. And can you also say to what extent you're aware of, what is the Indo-Guyanese participation in terms of the vote share? Dr.
Well, I don't know the exact numbers, but David seems to be comfortable with the numbers. But the problem is this. We had 2015. We had an election where, even though David may disagree with this, you had a coalition, and that coalition would have drawn support from the Indian community, right? Now, we can talk about the 11% or the 12% or whatever that number is. But in reality, you have the AFC and you have the APNU coming together, and they won a majority. So if you are going to place emphasis primarily on trying to get African Guyanese to come out to get those few seats, you also have an opportunity among the mixed community. They're about, I believe, 20%. The Amerindian community are about 12%. And by the way, we don't have the results of the census. And there are some indication that some people do believe that the Indian population has declined even further, and it's probably around 35%. Now, be that as it may, what I'm trying to say here is that you can win an election, yes, and David may be correct, if you work among your own community and the Amerindian community. And I know, Nigel has some connection there, but here's what we're saying. When you make a statement like that we're going to focus primarily on these communities and ignore the other, you are creating a situation where
Beto, don't lie on me in front of my own face. I didn't say ignore the other. I'm saying it's the hardest group.
Well, you're not,
if you must go, I've outlined a strategy. I've said, let your Indian comrades go there, right? So I am not ignoring. I'm talking about emphasis where you ground your strategy. It doesn't mean that your strategy does not include others. Please do not lie on me in front of my own face.
But
David,
all have a chance to respond.
If I might,
but Dr. Ramarat, I do think that Dr. Hines did not say I am not going to participate.
Okay, yes, but what I'm saying is 2015 showed that Indians would have supported the opposition, so the PPP lost, right? So whatever number of votes, whether it's 11% or 10% or whatever you want. The point I'm trying to make, and this is the broader point here that we need to consider, if you are saying that, what David is ignoring is the fact that when that 11% or 12% became part of that coalition, look at the way that that percentage or those people who represented that percentage were treated. So it makes sense, and I can see your rationale for making that argument, because you, in a sense, are writing off that percentage of Indians who you would have gotten if you were working among them. But the broader implication here is that the problem is we've seen what happened in 2015 when that number of votes were given, again, regardless of the percentage. We've seen what that kind of government has done to the Indian community. We can talk about the sugar workers, who were, neglected and who were fighting for severance pay. We can talk about, in fact, Nigel talked about this on David Hines' show. He talked about the fact that the arrangement, because somehow And I'm sure, David, if you win, if let's say the coalition wins again in 2025, you are going to reach out to the Indian community. So the question is, how are you going to do that? Nigel gives a scenario where it was agreed, and this again, the PNC, WPA, and AFC were all part of this arrangement where it was agreed upon that Kamraj would have been, to address this ethnic security dilemma we're talking about, Kamraj would have been the Minister of Home Affairs, and Moses Nagamutu would have been the Minister of Agriculture to allay some of the fears that Indians may have had. But look at the way they were treated in that arrangement. So again, if we are listening to what David is saying, okay, and you corrected me, fair enough. My question is, when you get in, as you have done in the past, what is the guarantee that we have that you are going to make arrangements? And by the way, we have been on record to talk about the ways we can address this ethnic security dilemma. And incidentally, Barnum didn't just kill, the ethnic security dilemma by abolishing elections. He did that by reducing the Indian population, which was about 52% in 1980. But nobody talks about that. That's a sidebar story. But again, what I'm trying to say is that this kind of discussion we're having, my question is, how are you going to bring in that percentage of people that you're now not focusing primarily on? Because we have seen what you have done in 2015. Now, and the question is, how is the WPA, PNC, or AFC going to convince the rational Indian voter that we are going to represent everyone? We are going to represent you, because all Irfan Ali or Bara Jagdev has to say is that, look what happened in 2020. These guys were all part of it. So how are you going to bridge that ethnic security dialogue, or address that issue, which is what we're talking about here? All of us agree that ethnicity is an issue. Why should an Indian who's supporting the PPP say, look, I'm going to vote for these guys because Nigel and David is a consensus candidate, you got Norton, so therefore they look like it's a good team. But we have a party that's hanging on by the slim vote of one vote. That scenario that you're presenting here, David, is a narrative that says we don't give a damn about the Indians. We're going to focus on our own. We're going to win. And the evidence has shown 2020 that when you win, everything you say about power sharing and everything else is out the window. So where does that leave us?
Vincent Alexander, where does that leave us? You see, I come to you as the voice of levity in this context to bring us.
I'm getting a lot of compliments tonight.
Where does this
mobilization
leave?
Before I get to the point of what has the exchange between David and Bertrand, we need to recognize that politics, elections is about turnout. And that in a system where you have this problem of a possible majority determining everything to the exclusion of others, then there are people who lose faith in the system. And therefore, whilst we're talking about who will vote for who, we're not talking about the people who decide elections is a waste of time, nothing changes, so we're not going to vote. To add to that group of people, the other question is the trust in the electoral system. And we know that lots of people are of the view that there is a bloated list, a list which has been and can be manipulated, and therefore you don't stand a chance. And so, for me, mobilization also has to be centered around showing people how those efficiencies can be used. In other words, how can we have a change in the system of governance that ensures inclusion, so when people vote, even if the party don't win, we have some assurance that it's a system that is inclusive and therefore we will have a say in the matter. How do we get people to believe that the list is not bloated, that we don't have irregularities that make the difference, and therefore don't make a difference whether you vote or not? Now, there are those who would like to argue, well, you know, there are no irregularities, the system is perfect. I beg to differ with them evidentially. Evidentially, because in 2020, the COMP was able to produce evidence to the contrary. That evidence did not weigh on the results because it was contended that these things are matters for a petition, and I think that's a flaw in our legal system. It didn't anticipate that kind of occurrence. But certainly in 2020, the APNU, AFC, and the COMP questioned the presence of certain people, presented those questions to GCOM in the forms of names, actual names. The GCOM sent forward 2 sets, totaling about under 600 of such names. Immigration verified somewhere in the vicinity of 75 to 80% correctness of that question mark. All the other names that GCOM threw, like APNU, AFC threw up, were not sent for verification, and in fact have since been corralled by the Attorney General. And one has to ask the question, why, if his contention that these people were in the country and voted, why doesn't he send that for verification, as the first 2 sets were sent and verified that 80-something% of those people were out of the country? So there were serious problems in terms of the system itself being a source of mobilization or demobilization, and that our whole question of elections, we're dealing with a dysfunctionality rather than a functioning democratic system. Having said that, the question of the results of 2011 and 2015 have to be taken in conjunction also with the results of 2006 and 2020. What happened in 2006? Essentially, the AFC pulled the votes from the PNC.
PNC.
And you've seen that in terms of the results in New Amsterdam. You've seen that in terms of the results where our good friend Bernard comes from, Electoral. We got to 2011, where the AFC rebalanced itself in some regards, and therefore were able to get Indian Guyanese. Same thing happened to some extent in 2015. It was reversed in 2020. It is therefore not correct to argue that based on the demography that the opposition has the scope to get crossover votes, or whatever kind of votes you call them, and to win an election that easily. Because the fact of the matter is that even though we may contend the opposition got those votes in 2011 and 2015, they got those votes as ethnic votes. They didn't get them as votes that came because of the nature of the campaign. They came as ethnic votes. And we saw, because those ethnic votes, as you said, weren't represented in 2015, they went back home. And so ethnicity is still largely, in this demographic shift, was not reflected in the way in which the voting patterns can make a difference, because one also has to factor in the turnout. And so the fact of the matter is, and the core of the matter is still the question of the ethnic vote. And even in terms of the numbers, there are great attempts at ethnic rebalancing in this country. Let me tell you how it's happening. We are doing registration. You know what the PPP is doing? They are bringing back the people from Nigeria to register. This is literally happening as we speak. And that has been facilitated, and here I'm going to go to the legislative aspect. That is being largely facilitated by a change in the Representation of the People's Act, which says you don't have to do physical identification or physical verification. Once somebody registers at an address that exists, that suffices for verification. So we have cut out physical verification. So what is happening? People turn up in Barbies from Nigeria. They don't have any address in Nigeria. In fact, when you speak to them, they come from West Nigeria. But they live in Nigeria. It's going to be easy for them to come and vote in Barbies. So you bring them to register in Barbies and you provide them with addresses. And this is happening. So there is an attempt to rebalance that ethnic equation. And in a place like Nigeria, you're talking about probably 20 to 30,000 Indo-Guyanese who reside in there. So that the mobilization is still largely centered around ethnicity. And in the context of it being centered around ethnicity, what is also occurring is demobilization of the people of African descent by various mechanisms. And so if you don't favor the PPP, you don't benefit from the large that's out there. And so people are being bought, literally bought by association, because, you know, I have a relative who at his heart is not a PPP, but he's a contractor. And he said to me, you got to live. You got to live. And so he wears the red shirt to live. That I refer to as ethnic demobilization, in the sense that here's somebody who's a natural supporter of the APNU, but will not necessarily identify with them any longer, because individualism and its survival is at the center of this action, and therefore we gone where the action is. And that is a part of what is happening in the struggle between the PPP and the PADG. The PADG was not a declared anti-PPP body, but certainly in its advocacy, it came up against things the PPP would have been doing. And so what has the PPP has done? They have gone out there to demobilize African Guyanese, who may naturally be of the PNC, by financial demobilization or financial mobilization. And so you take away PADG's subvention. You tell a set of lies about the PADG in terms of its fiduciary responsibilities. And then you start to dish the money out somewhere else to the African Guyanese community, as if you really care about them, when in fact, you're not doing anything the decade really calls for. And I can't be fooled that giving these people even the $1 million that could be given for the drumming competition in Amsterdam really addresses the African Guyanese dilemma. But you dole it out in a circumstance where people are needy, they want, and therefore in the interest of the individual survival, they are demobilized and they go over to the other side. So that we have a situation really where the problem on one hand is a problem of an electoral system, and a system of governance that is patently dysfunctional, patently unfair, and requires a new approach. A new approach which will not fly in the face of ethnicity, because the new approach will provide for the kind of shared governance that will allow everybody to be comfortable and to vote for who they want to vote for. vote who would want to vote for. And to understand that when we talk about this, Ravi talk about this qualitative shift, quantitative to qualitative. I do agree with Ravi that, well, in terms of numbers, there may be some quantitative changes that would have taken place. But I don't think those quantitative changes in electoral terms have necessarily meant a qualitative change, because the fact of the matter is, who is elected, the evidence suggests, it still governs in the interests of the ethnic group. That's the majority that represents them. So in that regard, there's no qualitative change. And the people who come across because of their survival needs have to subjugate themselves to programs and all sorts of things that don't necessarily represent the collective interests of the group which they came from, but may represent them getting individual handouts and therefore being able to survive. So for me, I call it quantitative change and the possibility of the electoral results reflecting the opposition party winning. It's not representing anything qualitative, because as my first argument says, it is still ethnic voting that caused that to happen, given the nature of the AFC. And secondly, the instance where it is not ethnic voting, the dominant factor in the decision making and governance and so still continues to be ethnic, and therefore there's really no qualitative change in that regard. So it brings us down to the fact of, at the end of dominance of the ethnic element, and the fact that a lot of engineering is being done around ethnicity, whether it's mobilization or demobilization, to allow the ethnic parties, so to speak, to prevail or not prevail in the elections. And I'd like to point to one more legislative issue, because what I referred to just now included a legislative issue, where in the amendment of the RUPA, the facilitation now of being registered without being verified allows the PPP to bring people home from Nigeria to be registered, and therefore to rebalance the ethnic equation. But the legislative changes have also provided for acquisition of birth certificates in a manner that lends to corruption of the electoral roll. Because birth certificates are now being acquired simply by some Tushaw signing on to say this person was born here. And we are making the assumptions that all of this is honest transactions. And so the people from across Venezuela and from Brazil can come home, and they can claim that they were born in Guyana, they get a birth certificate, and they get onto the roll. And so that again represents re-engineering of our electoral roll. But more than that, and everything I speak about, I have evidence. This is not merely theorizing. This is not conjecture. This is evidential. We have situations where we are finding in the registration process that somebody turns up with the identical information with someone else, but the person is not physically the same person. It's two persons. So you have two persons with identical information. And you ask the question, how is that possible? Because biometrics can't catch that. Because once two persons get onto the roll, right, in their own right, so to speak, but the information is the same, the biometric is not the same. Physical person is not the same. And you know what can make that possible? The manner in which birth certificates could be acquired. So I can go to a fellow citizen and borrow his birth certificate. And having borrowed his birth certificate, I then go to the immigration office and I get a passport. And then I turn up to vote with the passport. So I can become a Guyanese through that flawed system that allows anyone to register not only with his passport, not only with his birth certificate, but with his passport. So rather than facing GCOM with a primary document, you take somebody's primary document and manufacture a birth certificate, a passport that you then use to register. So that gives you legitimacy outside the person. It's just that perchance some vigilance in GCOM shows up that happening. And you start to ask your questions, how many of these instances have occurred where people have used borrowed birth certificates to get passports and then to get onto our electoral roll. So we have an extremely dysfunctional system. And this whole question of a discussion on mobilization towards elections is being built upon an electoral base that is corrupt, dysfunctional, and need electoral system that is corrupt and dysfunctional and need to be scrapped. And there's really no future for us if we do not address those fundamental issues.
Well, I thank you. You've offered a very sort of sobering a picture of the structural issues that attend to this question of voter mobilization, and what you've already, in some sense, there is a voter mobilization on the way, and I actually wanted to raise this question. So I'll come to Ravi now. So, you know, Mr. Alexander raised these issues of actual structural electoral reforms that, in a sense, he believes are sort of impacting voter mobilization. You know, people are being registered to vote in some context that offers, that is clearly not within, as he describes them, not within the confines of the, you know, the change in the representation of the People's Act, which allows for how folks get onto the rolls, definitely raises some questions. So I want you to speak to these sort of structural issues of the potential electoral reforms that are impacting voter mobilization and potentially the overall election process, as has been described. I had meant to sort of ask about this biometrics, but I guess you're raising this in this context. And then the second question, coming back to the earlier argument, which I'm still having I'm still not clear about what my final position is here. You know, strategically, in a historical sense, have there been things that have been strategies that have been effective in engaging voters in Guyana, you know, across ethnic lines? And, you know, how can you think about this within the context of 2025? You know, when we've sort of gone down this rabbit hole of the ethnicity, it's overdetermined everything. When Dr. Hanks started off, he pointed to the external forces. He pointed to the issue of equitable distribution of resources. He pointed to the issue of cost of living. You know, can those, you know, as they say in America, these bread and butter issues ever overcome these questions of the ethnicity? Ravi?
Well, you know, it's a lot of questions that's been thrown out there. So let me disaggregate them, because there is the connection, and the connection is ethnicity. That's the common thread running through everything in Guyana, unfortunately, but that's the reality. And the question for us then is, how do we deal with it? And I come back with, we as individuals who have studied this area have to come up with certain normative aspirations. And this is where, again, I will say, David, as he said to his face, that I'm a bit disappointed in some of his articulation of the mobilization, of how mobilization ought to proceed. For instance, the PPP, since it came up with the civic component back in '92, Dr. Jagan they have now used the civic component for African Guyanese representation, and they have this formula that the president is from the PPP, the Prime Minister is from the African Guyanese constituency coming out of their civic. We as ROAR have said that they ought to improve that, and we had explicitly spoken both to Mr. Hoyt and to the PPP that that representation in a core in a party outside of its core base ought to be much more explicit. And we had made a suggestion of a caucus, that the PPP ought to have an African caucus where they meet outside of the regular PPP to articulate, discuss, what have you, and then present African Guyanese perspective on particular issues. And we said the same thing to the PNC. And I would confess here, I've mentioned it before, Mr. Hoyt and I spent 3 nights discussing this. He said he would present it to the party, but he came back to me and he said it was not okay, that the radicals in the party disallowed it. That was early in 2002, before he passed. But the point is that—
Just allow me to cut you for 1 second.
Yeah, boy.
Allow me to cut you for 1 second to say
Yeah.
that in the People's National Congress reform, I am the one who articulated what I call ethnic politics. That is not different from what you're talking about. I articulated that at Mr. Hoyt's time.
Yes.
It was not objected to, but nothing was done about it.
I remember, and that is where you, Mark, and you know, others, you know, had some words with the leadership at that point. But to come back to it, what I want to say is this: is that we who are involved have to at least aspire to reach across, not just to, as David is doing, to say that we must now focus on just the ethnic base. And now David again erupted and said, well, you know, to his face, David, I think was lying. But David has used a term which I find so objectionable to my very core. A man who was involved with the WPA, the only party I ever gave money to, the only party which I invited in when I was in New York, way back, Mr. Kwayana. That for him to use the word that if the party, the PPP, tries to solicit Indian votes, they are actually, those people who work with them in the Afro-Guyanese community are now slave catchers. Now,
you mean if they solicit African votes?
Right, those, right.
And I didn't call those as soliciting. I say if you go and try to catch our people, you're slave catcher.
You can use the word catch, but the point is they go in with whatever. Listen, let me just finish. The point is, in democratic politics, in New York, they used to call it Tammany Hall politics. You know, we can now talk about buying votes and all that, but it's part of the democratic process across the world. You give to some things to people to get them to vote for you. It might sound ultimately transactional, but all politics ultimately is transactional. We want something for something. You scratch my back, I'll scratch your back. But for us to call them slave catchers, it goes to my very gut. I'm really bothered by it, because look, because it's not an easy term. You know, look what happened with what those slave catchers in Africa did to 12 million people across the Atlantic, and look what happened. Of course, we can't do that. And that's why I responded then that if Nigel, for instance, went to Leonora and tried to get Indian votes, should we then call him Harkati? And that's the equivalent term. The Harkati was the mispronunciation in Bhojpuri of the word recruiter, became Harkati. Should we call him an Akati who is telling all kind of lies that you'll just go to Guyana and sift sugar from gold? You know, that's not it. Let me just say personally, in my own activity as being in the opposition to the PPP, the PPP plays its own form of politics, and so does the PNC. You get me? I mean, in this thing, there's no idealism here. This is real politics, both parties. So, for example, when Roar and his associate Jiha had Indian Arrival Day, and we draw 20,000 people to Everest ground, when we draw 20,000 people across in West Demerara. The PPP founded the IAC to counter that. So it's not just an African thing to go hunting for African. That's how they play politics. They try to cover the space. I'm not saying if it's good, bad, or indifferent, but when we give this ethnic specificity, it adds to the kind of anger for these people to come and catch slaves. And what happened to those people in the community? There is this bright young girl who I've spoken about in the village of Ifat. I can only speak of that which I know, because in my village, as an old man now, I go and meet my old friends that I went to school with, that was split asunder by the riots. And we talk about it. There's this young kid, Mac's niece, Tandai Mac Alistair, and she is now mobilizing on behalf of the PPP. Now, is she a slave catcher? Is she a slave catcher? She's not. She's a bright lawyer. Bright things have happened to her within the party, where she felt slighted back in 2015 and what have you. But human beings will go through that, and we cannot give them these labels that, in a sense, will stick to them. All I will caution, David, is that let's stick to that. I don't think Nigel is a slave catcher, is an Harkati. And I'll share this with you. 2 years ago, I went around the country and met all road people who had, because once you leave the PPP and you leave, you ain't coming back. Those road people then went on to AFC. Most of them became the AFC strongest Indian supporters. You scratch most of the organizers for AFC, and they were from the Roar group and all that. And when they spoke to me, Nigel wasn't running then. But they know I'm a friend of Nigel. I always consider Nigel a friend of mine, going back to 2 decades, when on his own volition, he helped somebody in Roar with a problem, and we all became friends after that. The point is, though, that when they speak of Nigel, they speak of him in awe, in terms of his willingness to listen, more than Kemraj Ramjatan, with his willingness to act upon when he tells you going to do something, do that. So I do not want us to give up on the notion that you can get votes. I'm not so it'll be a deluge initially, but we got to start somewhere. And I think that our nation of minorities gives us somewhere to start. So if we start at least by starting with the rhetoric, and even if you remain there at the rhetoric, as some cynical politicians will do, you can get caught up in your own rhetoric. And for example, that's what Gandhi did with the British. You get me? They had the rhetoric of being ethical and moral and all of that. And he, in a sense, showed that the emperor had no clothes, and they were forced to put on some clothes and offer that. I'm saying I believe in Guyana right now. We are at a critical moment with all this money pouring in. And this money ain't going, for whatever reason, it's not going to everybody. We all know that. And therefore, what has to be done, as I see some people are doing, is to talk to people as their people, not necessarily ethnically. You understand? And I think we can get somewhere. And I do believe that comes 2025, there can be significant shifts. That's my belief. And I'll leave it at that.
Well, thank you. We're right up on the hour here. So, there were a number of other issues which we haven't, which I thought of coming in, which we haven't really talked about. I wanted you guys to weigh in, for example, on this kind of show that we're doing now in a kind of technology-aided social media way. I really wanted to kind of drill down on some of the issues that you're raising relative to youth, and to think through from the question of mobilization, the youth. And what it seems to me is that we don't have accurate data about what the actual demographics of the Guyanese population. No one seems to be able to know with any real precision what percentage of the electorate is Afro-Guyanese, what percentage of the electorate is Indo-Guyanese, what percentage of the electorate is, over 65, what percentage of the electorate is 18 to 27, and so on. So I think that's one issue for someone who's listening to be able to find. So, just given the hour, we haven't talked about civil society. Given the hour, I think we'll have to ask Nohar to do this, something like this with Mr. Alexander mentioned at the beginning the scope. I think our scope was a bit too big here for the time that we. So I'll maybe start. So we'll go Dr. Ramharat, Mr. Alexander.
I'm sorry. I have something else to get to. I thought we were going to finish at 9, and I had another commitment.
Yeah, so that's the point. I want to end, but I was just going to give, you kind of had a chance at the closing statement, so no, I wanted to give.
I'm sorry, I will pass on that. I really ask to be excused because I have another commitment, very, very serious commitment.
Okay, very well. And so I will ask the other folks, yes, if they, to just kind of take 2 minutes to talk about, predictions and expectations. So I'll go. I'll
excuse. Okay, thank you.
You got it. Thank you. And so we'll first go to Dr. Ramharat, then to Mr. Alexander, and then we'll close with Dr. Hines. So 2 minutes on, based on this discussion that we've had, your expertise, what are you predicting for this at this point, this early way out, just a sense of where you think this thing is going in 2025, perhaps in November?
Well, I think the key word here is predicting, right? How do we go and where do we go beyond this? And I think it's important for us to remember that we have always been consistent in what we have said in terms of being able to address this ethnic issue that we're dealing with. And we have suggested a number of specific proposals. I'm not going to go into detail, obviously. We've talked about the whole issue of decentralization, for instance, right? We've talked about the issue, Ravi mentioned the notion of a caucusing. It can include a caucus of African leaders and also Amerindians who can articulate their own views and have those views expressed in a way that you have national policies that can address those ethnic concerns. We've talked about affirmative action, those people who may not be well equipped to be able to take advantage of all the changes that are taking place, then some kind of affirmative action would be essential, whether it's providing resources or helping people to write grants or helping them to access resources of the state. So we've talked about those things. The other issue is this whole question of an ethnic impact statement. I know Nigel has done something important, which I have to give him credit for, in terms of talking about the empirical data. Where is that data? How do we look at the data? And how do we use the data to inform public policy? He did a whole show, looking at the data of who's getting contract. But I'm hoping that we can extend that and look at the data, right, in terms of who's controlling the civil service, who's controlling the army, who's controlling the police, and let's use the data to inform those kinds of policies to change the institutional makeup, because that's all what inclusivity implies, and equity. And I think the last thing I want to mention, which is the whole notion of balance. Equity also includes the whole notion of balance. And if we're talking about creating a society where everybody has some kind of say and some kind of balance, then we also need to look at those institutions of power. If the army is overly representative of a specific group and not representative of the indigenous population or Indians, then maybe we need to address those things. And I think those would be some specific things which we have said. We have been on record of mentioning those things as part and parcel of what we would like to see in terms of changes.
Mr. Alexander?
When Beto said we, I wasn't quite sure which we he was talking about.
Roar. I thought about roar.
And because when you speak about issues of decentralization and things like that, I think I'm very much on the record as an advocate. I think we really have to bring to bear two things: the geography of our society and the database decision making. I think we have to combine those two things. in terms of determining our way forward. What has brought us to where we're at, and to unravel that, to further the geography, and to get to a point where we accept the plurality of our society, accept that there's need for equitable disposition to the ethnic groups. There's need for what I would normally call a system where tremendous devolution that allows groups to be able to, in their communities, to be responsible for what happens in the communities. And that can even affect the question of the police. You have local authorities that have their own constabularies. You could reduce the incursion of the national police into the local area, and in that way start to even balance that aspect of things. So I think that there are ideas out there that are useful, that can help us way forward, but I think that there's an absence of political commitment, and that really pressure has to be brought to bear one way or the other on the political parties to, first of all, accept our plurality on one hand, accept that there's a need for mechanisms for us to be cohesive as people of one state, and therefore out of that cohesion, which has built-in tolerance and facilitation at every level, economic, social, and every level, then we can in fact build the society we want to build. And that much of this could start with the way in which we configure our government. Much of this could start. The mere acceptance of a reconfiguration of government might be a commitment to doing things differently.
Well, Dr. Heinz, you get the last word. So the reconfiguring the government kind of starts with what we've started, the mobilization of voters. So, give a thought of where you see, based on where we are today, and your expertise, a sense of what elections look like as we move into 2025.
Elections under a winner-take-all system in a sharply divided society, ethnically as ours, is struggle. And we have seen that throughout our history. Whether it's rigging, whether it's violence, whether we had to wait 5 months while one party requests that GCOM intervenes, and then there's a recount, and that recount makes it last for 5 months. Whatever. Elections on the winner-take-all system in a sharply divided ethnic society like Guyana is trouble. It can only lead to disaster. It has led to disaster. That people can think that, and I agree, I don't think the opposition can go to Indian Guyanese with a straight face and tell them, come and vote for we left the PPP. But I equally do not believe that the PPP can go to an African Guyanese community after beating up on the teachers, killing their sons and daughters, taking away money from them, and tell them vote for we. I don't know if people know, but I talk to the slave catchers in my community. And that is why I call them slave catchers. The PPP goes in there, gives them money to destroy their own community. The PPP not looking for votes. As my brothers here said, the PPP know how to win the elections. And the PPP will not be stupid enough to depend on African Guyanese to win an election. They're not that stupid. They are going into the African Guyanese community not to get votes. Vincent, I think, put it quite mildly when he said they are going in there to demobilize voters, not to win votes. And I am surprised that my brothers actually don't know that, or they know it and pretending that they don't know it. It's an affront to the African Guyanese community, what the PPP is doing in the name of getting crossover votes. And I take my cue this past week from Ralph Ramkaran, who I disagree with most of the time. But Ralph Ramkaran says the PPP needs to agree to households registration with a clean voters list and the biometrics, he said, so that it wouldn't be a humbug for them during the election. And he was being nice. He was being nice. As I said, the issue of disenfranchisement is going to be big in the coming election. I repeat, winner take elections in an ethnically divided society is fraught with a lot of dangers. I will not predict. I'm saying upcoming election is not going to be a democratic walk in the park.
I think on that note, we should let it close. I was about to reference some, but I think we should let it end there. It's not going to be a walk in the park, and I hope that that these conversations can contribute to at least helping to shape it to be a less bumpy walk in the park, and that there will be a winner, and that the loser will be able to acknowledge that there was a winner, and that there will be something close to akin to people working together broadly in the interest of Guyana. So let's leave it there, and hopefully we can come up. But I think we've outlined the contours of something that will be difficult, and I think we all owe Guyana a debt in terms of helping her to turn this corner in a manner that is, to use your words, that does not disenfranchise, that does not dishonor, and certainly does not dispossess any Guyanese citizen of things that they hold dear. So we'll leave it there. Thank you, colleagues, for joining us, and
Gentlemen,
have a
good night.
Good night.